All right, welcome back. And our guest is Ken Block, and the book is Disproven, My Unbiased Search for Voter Fraud in the Trump Campaign, the data that shows why he lost, and how we can improve our elections. And we're going to spend a lot of time on election reform, not so much about litigating 2020. He's got a lot to say. How did he get involved in this? Well, he is president of a software systems company, Simpatico, a software engineer and entrepreneur, specializes in database technologies and groundbreaking projects such as the country's first statewide debit card benefit system. And in Texas, he saved them $1 billion off of the fraud and waste in their SNAP programs. But as he said, he wasn't really interested in getting involved in politics. But, sometimes we find that politics is interested in us. In the past decade, he's analyzed voter data from more than 40 states. The few that he has yet to analyze do not provide their data to the public. He has served as an expert in legal challenges that involve voting data, voter fraud, and election integrity. So we'll talk to him about all of these things and about what he has learned as he investigates this. What can we do to make sure that we have honest elections that are not going to be contested? Thank you for joining us, sir.
Thanks for having me.
It's very important because we've got a lot of people are very concerned about this, and rightfully so. A lot of people are ready to have a revolution if the candidate that they think should win does not win. And in a equally divided country like this, half the people are pretty much feeling that way. I saw that your foreword was written by Brad Raffensperger, the Georgia Secretary of State, that, again, over the weekend, I talked about this at the beginning of the program. Trump was furious at Governor Kemp. He didn't talk about Raffensperger, but they have in the past. And he is, and I said this about him, I said, it's unfortunate that he is so focused on revenge that he can't be focused on even winning, let alone on reform. And so I want to talk about that. But before we get into what we can do for reform, tell us a little bit about your take on what happened in Georgia, where you investigated.
Yeah, it's the idea that in states that are whisker close, and we have a bunch of them. We have Arizona, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Michigan is not really whisker close, but close enough. Nevada, the idea that if the election goes one way as opposed to another, that the only explanation for it must have been fraud, is not an accurate way to depict what happened in these elections. And in Georgia in 2020, there's a ready explanation for what happened. And Georgia is maybe in a lot of ways the closest state that we have in terms of being evenly divided between Democrats and Republicans. The results of the 2020 election have been gone up and down and backwards and forwards and sideways, and there really hasn't surfaced any credible claim of voter fraud that could be proven. And in my work for the Trump campaign, I was hired very specifically to do data analytics that would stand up in a court of law. My job was to find enough voter fraud to matter in one of the swing states, document it, and have it be so rock solid that when it got taken to court, the other side's experts wouldn't be able to tear it apart. That's sort of the gold standard when you're dealing with legal challenges to elections. You have to have a foundation of fact in which to be successful in court. Mm-hmm. And the simple fact of the matter is, whether it was Georgia or any of the other swing states, while we found some voter fraud, we didn't find nearly enough to cover the margin of victory. And the margin of victory in Georgia was roughly 12,000 votes. It was roughly 11,000 votes in Arizona, roughly 90,000 votes in Pennsylvania. And in none of those states did we find enough voter fraud to cover what those margins were. And so, and that's just a plain statement of fact. And there were so many election challenges that failed in the court system because the nature of their proof wasn't acceptable proof in courts of law. Right. And that's just sort of a.
Was there ever any talk about them taking their findings? I know that you were there to prepare the findings that they would use to argue the case. But did they ever talk about taking the case instead of to a court to the legislature? Because I know 4 of these razor-thin margin of victory for Biden, 4 of these states had Republican legislatures. Were they ever talking about presenting a case to the legislature to get them to acknowledge a Republican slate of electors officially? And then you would have had, as Thomas Massey talked about, as Pence talked about, as J.D. Vance recently talked about, to have then a court case as to who gets to decide who the electors are. Is it going to be the governor and the executive branch, or is it going to be the legislative branch? Was there ever any talk about taking the case to the legislatures?
So I wasn't part of any strategy meetings inside the campaign. My job was incredibly focused, and I had 30 days to do what amounted to about a year's worth of work. So I was highly occupied and segmented away from everything else that was swirling around the campaign at the time. What I would say in general is that legislatures probably are not the best body to try to ascertain a very technical determination, which was, did fraud occur and how did it occur? Many members of legislators don't have that in their background. So it would be my preference that if it's going to be contested, that it gets contested in a venue where they can handle highly technical presentations and digest the facts. And our court system does that all the time. Legislatures typically don't. So that's just from a process perspective. That's kind of where I'm at.
Sure.
In Georgia, there are 3 different data points that really help document what really happened in Georgia. And I know that in a lot of conservative circles, Secretary Raffensperger is not well liked. But the data that he brought forward and can document, has documented, and it's hard proof, he showed that about 30,000 GOP presidential primary voters in Georgia in 2020 took a pass on the general election. Those are lost presidential votes for President Trump, and he lost by fewer than 12,000 votes. Now, those 30,000 votes were probably moderate Republicans, call them rhinos, whatever you want to call them, who probably voted against Trump in the primary and then decided they couldn't bear to vote in the general election. And there was another 30,000 votes that Raffensperger brought forward and has the proof for, that showed that the presidential selection was left blank, but all the down ticket Republicans received votes. And again, that's a sort of symbolic protest votes by very likely middle of the road Republicans who liked to down ticket GOPs, but didn't like what was at the top of the ticket. And that's hard evidence to overcome. And there's really no credible fraud that you can look at that comes close to having the solidity of the numbers that that Raffensperger brought forward. That matches with what my nationwide findings are, and those are basically that Trump lost about 2.5% support across the board everywhere in 2020 relative to 2016, and those are the rhinos. I'm pretty sure those are the rhinos who took a hike and left. It's not a lot of voters, but in a whisker close election, it was enough.
Well, it's probably people who were not too happy with what had happened the first part of 2020. Let me ask you, with the lockdowns and things like that, that kind of soured a lot of us on what was going on. But let me ask you about the vote by mail thing, because that was a function of the lockdown as well. And we'd never done that before. How did you audit, or how did you view the vote by mail stuff?
So we looked at the mail ballots, not so much from the process of mail ballots. Were there changes to rules made to allow mail ballots to be changed, how mail ballots were used? My role in looking at them was, were dead votes cast by mail? Did people who voted by mail vote twice in 2 different places? It was the nature of what I was looking at was those sorts of things. It was really a remarkable period of time in a lot of different ways. And honestly, I think maybe had we not had COVID, I actually believe there was a better than even money chance that President Trump would still be President Trump right now. I think COVID cost him dearly. in this election. Did mail ballot use tip the balance? I don't think so, because I think anybody who was motivated to vote would have figured out how to vote one way or the other. The presumption is, were mail ballots used in some nefarious way? Was massive mail ballot fraud happening? And I didn't see evidence of that. I mean, to commit mail ballot fraud, you're either going to steal someone's identity and vote as somebody else, or you're going to steal a deceased person's identity and do that. And we found a couple of dozen dead votes in most of the swing states. We found a couple of hundred duplicate votes across the swing states. And the campaign spared no expense on this. We exhaustively looked at every single mail ballot to ensure that the person in whose name that mail ballot was cast was among the living.
And what do they do to cast a ballot? Do they have to request it, and is it mailed to them at an address or something? Or do they just pick it up and then mail it in themselves? How did that work?
So what's really frustrating is it's different from state to state to state. We're going to get into that down the line. In many states, you have to fill out a mail ballot application, mail it in, they verify your signature, and then when the time is right, they'll mail you a ballot that you then return.
That's like the absentee ballot process that we've had for a very long time, right?
Right.
Yeah.
A few states, and this happened before COVID, states like California and Oregon and Colorado, interestingly, have moved to entirely conducting their elections by mail. They send out mail ballots to everybody. And if you don't want to vote by mail, you have to take extraordinary actions to opt out of voting by mail and instead to vote in a different way. So we had a mix of those different things. Many states made voting by mail easier in 2020. The hardest state in the country to vote by mail is, I believe it's Louisiana, that has very strict usage in terms of who can use it under what circumstances. So it's all over the map. I didn't see any partisan slant to the mail ballot fraud that we did find. It was pretty evenly divided by Democrats, Republicans, Independents. And that's been the case of all the voter fraud I've documented over the years. I have yet to find a form of voter fraud where when it happens, it's just sort of a bipartisan activity.
How would you audit a situation to find out if somebody was voting for a dead person? And I ask because a friend of my brother-in-law's in 2012 in North Carolina, they have, at least at that time, they had the longest voting period of any state, and there was no picture ID. So you could just walk in and give them, you could vote early, and when you went to vote, you just give them a name and address, and there was no validation of that with even a driver's license. And so on election day, this friend of my brother-in-law's goes in and to register, he gives him his name and address, and they said, "You've already voted." And so is this other person at your address, and he said, "Well, that's my mom. She's been dead for several years." So how do you audit that to know if that is happening? In Georgia, for example.
Well, so in 2020, the Trump campaign had us process every single mail ballot voter in the swing states. There was about 31 million of them.
Wow.
We process them through a data vendor who matches up the voter with their social security number. And then using the social security number, you can look at something called the Social Security Death Master File, which is the Social Security Administration tracks everybody who dies. So we use that mechanism 31 million times for every mail ballot that was cast.
What did you find?
The election. Like I said, we found a couple, at most a couple of dozen in each swing state. Not nearly enough to matter. I did predict, because I had done an analysis in Pennsylvania about a month before the election. I found a couple of recently registered dead voters. And I predicted that those would become mail ballot fraud, and they did. Yeah.
Now, you did your research. You presented your findings to the Trump campaign and who had hired you, to their attorneys. And you also reported to Mark Meadows all of your results. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I didn't speak directly to Mark Meadows. The lawyer who hired me and who basically was my point person throughout this whole thing, Alex Cannon, he the basic premise of what I did were two different things. I looked for duplicate votes, I looked for dead voters, and then the campaign used my company to help vet every claim of voter fraud that came their way. And there were a lot of them from outside of the campaign. He asked us to vet them, determine whether they were true or not, before they would consider taking those claims into court. So they were operating in a very careful, methodical way. They asked us to review about 20 different claims of fraud. Some of them came in through folks like Sidney Powell and John Eastman. Others came through academics, just random people out there who did their own research. And every one of the 20 different claims that we looked at, we were able to show why it was wrong. When we wrapped things up towards the end of November, Cannon took the summation of everything that we had done and went to Mark Meadows and told Meadows that when it came to voter fraud, we looked pretty exhaustively at it. All the claims we looked at were false, and we couldn't find enough voter fraud to have changed the outcome in any election.
And when was that presented? What was the date that roughly that you presented that stuff?
I didn't do a presentation to anybody. Every one of the claims I looked at had its own email and documentation, and all that landed on Cannon's desk. Cannon took that all together and went and talked to Meadows, I believe, right at the end of November. And gave him the summation of everything. Okay,
all right, and so it was December the 14th that the electoral colleges, the people that were selected, the slate of electors from each party that had won, submitted their votes on December 14th. The January the 6th was a formal acceptance of all that stuff, but everybody presented that stuff on December the 14th. So they knew the end of November. They knew a couple of weeks before the Electoral College voted. And then again, about 6 weeks or so before the January the 6th thing, they had those results in. What did you think about the Stop the Steal stuff? You mentioned that you debunked fraud claims by those advancing the Stop the Steal initiative. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, as I looked at everything, I wasn't aware usually of where the claims came from. I was able to piece a lot of it together afterwards. Mm-hmm. From the Sidney Powell, John Eastman perspective, I didn't know that the claims that I found were false that they brought forward came from them until about a year ago, really. Yeah. So it's the whole problem with Stop the Steal, and with a lot of so many people believe firmly that the election was stolen, but that belief is based upon a set of facts that's at best really, really squishy. Mm-hmm. Right. What I mean by that is the facts on which the claims are being made that everybody's grabbing onto and says it was stolen can't possibly ever stand up in court, usually for a really basic reason, because that reason is it's hearsay evidence. So what I mean by that, hearsay is often defined as he said, she said type stuff.
Right.
And our courts don't allow that kind of evidence on which to convict somebody, because someone can easily be lying about that, right? The court systems want to see fact-based evidence that can be double and triple checked, hard facts.
Sure.
And most of the evidence that people are being presented as evidence that the election was stolen is squishy evidence. It's not the kind of evidence that you could take to court and win. And that to me is really something that I have a problem with, because I'm a data guy. I take data to court, and my data survives legal scrutiny, right? So if you can't find data that survives legal scrutiny, I think it's sketchy to start bringing forward data that can't, and then using that information to really get people amped up about what happened in our election. I do not believe that the election was stolen. I believe that the election in 2020 was lost.
I was very skeptical of it from the very beginning, actually. You know, when I worked at InfoWars, I had a show there, and 2 days after the election, Steve Pachinik came on and said that there had that it was a sting, that they had blockchain watermark ballots that had somehow come out of the federal government at some central location. But the key thing that was obviously disprovable was, he said 2 days after the election, so we got 20,000 National Guard that are out there arresting these people who rigged the election. Now, that obviously was not true, and I wasn't going to go down that path. So we had all kinds of stuff, but it was so many people, even weeks after that, when there was absolutely no evidence of any National Guard troops or any arrests or whatever, they were still pushing that. So I can imagine that somebody saying, yeah, we got pictures of, or I know personally about somebody stuffing a ballot box. That's going to be much more believable than the other stuff that people were fighting about and willing to go to the mat to say, yes, there is some secret war that is going on, maybe in Germany, maybe some places in the United States where people are actually, fighting and going to war over this. It really was a strange situation. One more thing I'd like to talk about before we start talking about how to reform this stuff. And that is the exit polls, which have kind of come in to play again with this Venezuelan election. The State Department has always used Edison Research, which is the exit polling organization here in the United States. And they say that, and they use them in other countries as well. And they say that if the difference between Edison Research's exit polls and the official results are more than 5 points away from each other, that it looks like it's a rigged election. Now, it's just one particular company, and of course that company can be rigged as well. We don't know about their integrity, but it is the company that is used for the exit polls by all of the media organizations in the United States. They typically don't give us, I've never seen them give us a total and say, well, here's what they say the total is, and compare that to what the reported votes were. They'll give you demographic cross tabulations, how many men or how many women or this or that voted for this candidate. But was there ever any talk about looking at the exit polls? Anything about that?
So I didn't know it at the time, but I learned of this about a year and a half ago. The Trump campaign commissioned their top pollster to conduct exit polls in the 2020 election in the swing states. That pollster's name is Tony Fabrizio. And just to be fully transparent, I'm a two-time candidate for governor here in Rhode Island, and in my run in 2014 as a Republican, Fabrizio was my pollster as well. So I just like to put that out there because I'm talking about him, and I just didn't want to do that without disclosing that. Fabrizio conducted a 30,000 interview exit poll across all the swing states. And he created an internal campaign document that leaked. And that document made its way to Politico.com, so anyone can find it there. But what he determined was that 1 out of 6 voters that they spoke with were disaffected Republicans who chose to vote against Trump in that 2020 race. Another 1 out of 6 voters were brand new voters motivated to vote against Trump because of COVID. So that's a full third of the voters that they had identified were strongly against Trump for different sets of reasons. So exit polls are typically take it to the bank type things, right? They're usually considered to be pretty accurate, and I've not ever heard of somebody manipulating the results of an exit poll. I don't know hardly anything at all about what's going on down in Venezuela right now, other than it's a mess.
It's another one of these things, right? And so that kind of gets us a lead into some of the things that we do about how to fix this based on your insights. But I think that's very important. I think it's very interesting that the Trump campaign did its own exit polls. And they didn't present that data. So presumably that data was not favorable to them. Didn't you, am I mistaken, did you debate Lindell on this, Mike Lindell?
I did. He and I appeared on a YouTube channel about a month ago, and with a host named David Pakman. And we had about a 45-minute conversation about voter fraud and what is there, what's not there, and even we got into a little bit the things that we need to do to fix things.
And I know that he held a press conference at one point in time, and Steve Bannon was there and a whole bunch of people, and Steve Bannon was just fed up. He said, well, we were told that he had receipts, and he goes, he doesn't have any receipts. He was really upset about it. Does he have any receipts yet?
No.
It's evidence free, right? That's very interesting. It really is sad to see. But let's talk about what we can do to fix the election system based on what you have seen and your opinions about it.
Yeah. So I think this is the most important thing to talk about. I mean, 2020 is long gone and
That's
it's
right.
in the rearview mirror. There's nothing that we can do at this point to alter the course of what's going to happen in 2024. It's going to be very, very similar, I believe, to what we experienced in 2020. It may be almost virtually identical. I wouldn't be surprised if the outcome is exactly the same, because the basic same setup is there that we had 4 years ago. The way we conduct our elections in this country is the way we've done it for hundreds of years, and it no longer makes any sense, and it causes us some real problems. And the biggest set of problems that we have is that different states and many times different counties in the same state conduct the same election differently. They have different rules, they have different regulations, they have different hardware. And I'll give you just a simple example of how these differences can actually affect the outcome of a specific vote. What do you think happens if you vote early but then die before election day? Does your vote count or does your vote not count?
I would think that it would count.
Depends on where you live.
There you go. It depends. Yeah.
Yeah. So in Michigan, it does not count. And in 2020, the state of Michigan invalidated about 3,500 votes by voters who voted early and then passed away before election day. In Pennsylvania, if you vote early and then pass away before the election, your vote does count. Mm-hmm. So some of the votes that people identified as deceased votes actually counted, because in Pennsylvania, that's not an illegal situation. As long as you cast the vote while you're alive, if you happen to then pass away before election day in Pennsylvania, the vote still counts. So it becomes, you can see how just that one scenario causes a voter that we imagine is in this situation to have a very different experience as a dead voter in Michigan as it does opposed to Pennsylvania.
And let me ask you this question before we move on, and because when you get these ballots in, I mean, what kind of records do you have to look at an early vote by mail ballot to know that this person voted that ballot and voted it at that date? You know, if they're going to count it, if the person is now dead, but they, to know that the person made this vote before they died. How do you audit that? What kind of information do they have in terms of auditability? Do they know the postmark date and the person's name on the ballot?
So they have postmark dates. They have names and addresses on the ballot application, which also goes on to the envelope that your mail ballot gets put into as you mail it back in. The trick is getting that information and being able to determine with certainty whether or not that voter is dead and alive or alive. And most people who do these analysis aren't able to arrive at an answer that is rock solid for sure.
Yeah. Seems like that'd be a big problem in Pennsylvania, where it's okay if they did it and then died. How do you determine that? That's tough, right? Right.
Well, I pointed out to the state of Pennsylvania through lawyers I was doing some work for in October of 2020, 2 registered voters who were dead, clearly deceased, identified them, and because they had registered in the last month, back in September of 2020, I said, these will become very likely fraudulent votes. The state didn't do anything about those voters. They did, in fact, vote by mail as deceased voters, and it was only after the election that the people behind those votes were contacted, arrested, and they pled guilty to election crimes for casting fraudulent votes. It's really hard. In fact, it's so hard to identify whether or not someone is living or dead. I think that the only reasonable thing to do is to probably allow the votes, as long as you're alive when you cast the vote. I think that the vote should count, because it's just so hard for states to determine otherwise inside a crazy window of time where they're trying to do a lot of other things. And again, we only were able to do what we did in terms of identifying deceased registered voters because the Trump campaign basically provided an unlimited pile of money that we were able to spend to do so accurately.
I guess that's really the issue, in terms of how do you validate that? And I guess the key issue is that people have to have trust in the election. And so it seems to me like there needs to be different ways that they can have either transparency and have the ballots retained. I know that in Texas, it was kind of a standard procedure, even though it was in the Constitution that a facsimile image of the ballot had to be retained. You had the guy who was in charge of the Board of Elections would send out a statement to all of the counties saying you don't have to retain it. And they would not retain it in a lot of these counties. And so it made the auditing process really difficult. But I think maybe, a lot of people who are looking at, let's just go simple. Let's go to hand-counted ballots. We know that people can always stuff stuff, but if you got hand-counted ballots and you got observers from both sides, it seems to me like you need to have something like that where people can have some confidence that the fraud has been kept to a minimum, that there's been eyes on this, that they have done that. What do you think about that? What are your recommendations in terms of paper ballots? I know that's a big paper chase, but what would you say about that?
Well, I think for sure when you vote, the vote should be on a paper ballot so that you have a physical representation of what happened, so that you can go back and analyze it. Any machine that allows you to vote electronically without paper ballot backup, I think is a terrible idea, and we shouldn't be there for sure. Let's use Maricopa County, Arizona, as sort of a proving ground for whether or not it's reasonable to count by hand all the ballots. So Maricopa has roughly 1.5 million voters that vote in its elections. On your typical Maricopa County ballot, there's anywhere between 20 and 30 different races on that ballot. Okay, it just depends on the year and where you are in the cycle of different things. Which means that in your typical election year in Maricopa, you have to, if you're going to count by hand, you have to tally up 20 to 30 million different distinct votes across all the different races that are there. That is a phenomenally large amount of votes, and no human counting effort will ever be anywhere near as accurate as a machine count can be. The problem and the worry about the machines is that they can be hacked, that they can be programmed maliciously before the election, that kind of thing. And I look at what the casino industry does. And in my background, I've done a lot of work in the gaming industry over the years. Many casino management systems have defensive software built into every one of those slot machines so that they know if the software deviates from what it should be. And I won't get into the technical details of it, but it's something that you can absolutely do. And it's something that you can absolutely bring forward into the election machine software. We have the ability to know with confidence what software is running on those machines. And we should be using it. And as I said to Mike Lindell is one of the big pushers of we need to be counting by hand. We need to be counting by hand. And what I'll say is, first of all, there's just no way that you can count 30 million votes accurately by hand. First of all, it would take forever to do that, right? You would need an army of people conducting the count, and then human beings make mistakes in that whole thing. It's just it is too big a job, I think, to do it manually. And as I said to Mike, Mike, the problem is you're talking about squishy reasons to count the ballots by hand, but you actually haven't pointed out something that is an actual risk that's happened that justifies making such a big change. So should we harden our machines? 100%. And we should have federal guidelines that all the machines have to adhere to so that we can have some confidence that they have not been hacked and that the software that they're running has been vetted and is working the way it needs to, and all that kind of thing. That's technology that's already in place. I just don't see how, I mean, if you or I were to sit down and start tallying votes on a ballot, maybe we could tally, if we were working really fast, 500 votes an hour, right? Maybe. I mean, and now think about getting to 30 million votes, 500 votes an hour at a time. It tells you how big the number is, right? The number is probably 60,000 hours of work to get that done in Maricopa. And I don't think going back to the Stone Age for how we count votes is going to be a workable answer for us in this modern age. Yeah,
it's again, when we look at the electronic stuff, and I always talk about, and I've shown several times, an example going back to the late 1990s, early 2000s. We have local college professors bring some kids in. They say, well, let's take over this machine here. And they put a virus on there that tilts everything according to their predetermined ratios and then erases itself. And so, the vulnerability there, I guess, is whether or not it's connected to the internet and whether or not somebody can reprogram it with, by putting a thumb drive on there and installing some software. How do you guard against that type of thing, that kind of custody of the machine, for example?
So, the physical, in the same way that slot machines have tremendous physical security around them in terms of surveillance, both electronic and people watching, it's the same thing with voting machines. The sensitive areas of the voting machine should be on the back of the machine where nobody is allowed, right? So, if you're putting a USB key in the front of the machine and someone can close they can close the curtains and plug something in. I mean, you violated Rule 101 of physical security. For those who understand machine security and how to make sure that the software that should be in there is in there, that's all a solvable problem. It really is.
And as part of your auditing, did you have videotapes of the physical security situation?
No. We were strictly focused on the data.
Okay.
They wanted me on the hard data that was going. That they were hoping was going to be able to go to court. I didn't get involved in any one specific local issue, and for sure I didn't get into any hearsay claims of any kind. There wasn't the time to get into that. Look, you hear a lot of people talk about election integrity, and I am a huge proponent of election integrity and making sure that the data for our elections is as clean as it can be. And one of the problems with having the states do their own voter registration, maintaining their voter rolls differently from each other, is you end up with some states that do a really good job at it, and you have some states that do an absolutely terrible job at it.
Yeah.
And the terrible side of things, I'm going to offer up two states, New Jersey and New York. In New Jersey, in 2020, there were roughly 25,000 voters registered who had a year of birth of 1800, okay? Which, if you do the math, you realize that there's just no way that any human being in 2020 had a birth date of 1800. And of those 25,000 registered voters with a birth date of 1800, 8,000 cast votes in 2020. Now, some of your listeners are going to be like, holy moly, that's voter fraud. It's probably not. What happens in a lot of different computer systems, and this is happening in New Jersey's system, if they don't have a date of birth for a voter, they stick 1800 in there as a placeholder. They didn't have anything else. So 8,000 voters in New Jersey cast votes in 2020 that state election officials don't know when those voters were born. Okay. Right. Now that's a problem all by itself. And it's one that election officials in New Jersey still haven't fixed. They have really, really dirty data, right? And you see all kinds of different ways that dirty data can impact registered voters and ultimately can even impact whether people should be voting or not, right? I think in New Jersey, you might find maybe some of those 8,000 voters shouldn't have been voting for some reason, but the state can't identify who those voters are. You have to know someone's date of birth to be able to identify them using data. And New Jersey can't do that. New York has a very similar problem and some worse ones, and I don't want to get too far into it, but there are millions of votes that happened in New York State in 2020 by voters that they cannot identify because those voters don't have a social security number or driver's license on file with election workers. That's an extraordinary thing, and it's a huge problem for New York election officials because they can't possibly maintain the data in their system without having that information. That's just two examples. When you move from one state to another, some states are able to track down the movement and cancel the registration for when somebody moves from state to state. A lot of other states cannot. And so we end up with people with duplicate registrations. We end up sometimes with people with 4 or 5 duplicated registrations. There's all manner of stuff like that that's happening. And for me as a technology professional, I can't stand the fact that our elections depend on data that at times can be extraordinarily dirty. And we have the technology and the means to fix this. And I think it's criminal that we don't.
And of course, we got a lot of jurisdictions where they want to give the vote to even non-citizens. So I mean, it's like there's just this whole spectrum of what is out there. So, in your opinion, what's the best way to fix this? I mean, do you have to have some kind of a national standard and some kind of inspectors? I mean, I think one of the reasons we have the kind of system that we've got is because there was an aversion to centralizing things. Because if you centralize things, now you've got one point that you can corrupt or you can infiltrate, and now you've got the entire system. So there's a danger in centralization as well. How would this work out?
So leaving any ideology out of my answer, as a technologist, the only sane way to conduct our federal elections is with a federal voter registration database. If we got rid of the 50 different implementations of voter registration that we have right now, in fact, it's way more than 50. Most large states make the responsibility of elections at the county level. And so in many ways, we have as many as 4,000 or 5,000 different election systems that all do things a bit differently from each other. Technologically speaking, the right answer, and we would eliminate most of the voter integrity issues that we suffer from if we had a federalized voter registry. I understand with states' rights and a whole bunch of either ideological arguments or even the security argument of, well, if you have just one, what happens? I don't believe that the voting should happen on a federal level with just one system. But I do believe that the voter registration should be done that way. So if somebody hacks a voter registration system, and by the way, how many counties do you know that have high quality data employees working for them, technologists, right? The lower down we push the conduct of our elections, I believe the more likely it is that those the county level is where it's most likely that you can see successful hacking, because they just don't have the technological expertise that you need as you would as you move your way up the chain to state level technologists and ultimately federal level technologists.
And of course, we've also seen the CIA and the NSA and the FBI and the military hacked as well. So from the top to the bottom, it's vulnerable. So it's a real quandary.
So voter registration in a lot of ways is less. The danger of a hack there is lower than the danger of a hack to an actual election system that conducts the process of our election. Right. So I believe it would be wrong to have federalized voting. I only talk about the voter registration with an eye towards the cleanest data that we can have. You know, we live in a society and an age where there probably isn't a computer system anywhere that's hardened well enough to prevent someone who's really determined to get at it. You have to watch it really carefully, and you have to see what you have to have the surveillance systems in place to know when it's happening and to stop it before it goes. You can put that sort of stuff in front of a system like if we were to do a federalized voter registration system. I think that system should also have biometrics on it. You know, we use Social Security numbers as the most sensitive identifier we have, right? If you're working at a job, you have to supply your Social Security number. It's how you file your taxes, all this stuff. You have to give a Social Security number to any banks that you want to open up bank accounts with. And the problem is hackers have every one of our Social Security numbers, all of them, right? They've been hacked so many times, it's no longer secure. I think we should replace Social Security numbers with a new identifier. We're the only first world country that doesn't have a national identifier.
Well, what happens if you do a biometric and somebody steals your database? Now they've stolen your face. What do you do? I mean, if they steal your passcode or something, you get a new one. Have to go get plastic surgery or to vote again. What do you do with that? To me, that's a big issue. And of course, you know, when we look at creating, you know, a lot of us have very strong concerns about creating a centralized state where we have to have some kind of a centralized ID, you know, that kind of flows into a CBDC type of scenario and other concerns about a global ID. And so that gets a lot of people to take the safety off their gun when you start talking about that type of thing.
No, I get it. But if your concern is election integrity, the biggest threat to integrity is the way we currently conduct the election. I mean, that's just a simple statement of fact.
Well, let me ask you this, you know, as unwieldy as it is, you know, when they ran elections in Iraq, what they did was they did it on one day. And, you know, they couldn't tell if these people were legitimate or if they'd walked across the border, but they could keep them from voting multiple times. And so you would go in and you'd vote on paper, and then you would get this indelible stain on your thumb that's going to be there for the rest of the day so that you couldn't vote again. If we go ultra crude like that, I know it's a big hassle to count this stuff, but I mean, if people really wanted a system, they would invest the time in terms of maybe volunteering or something like that. I know that's idealistic, but I mean, why not go ultra low tech? One day and the purple thumb.
I mean, how many elections that way do you hear stories about a whole bunch of ballots being stuffed anyway, right? Yeah. Even people have ink stained hands that doesn't handle the physical security of the actual ballot box sitting there. You know, look, I live in a state where it wasn't all that long ago where some elected officials were arrested driving around with a bunch of absentee ballots in the trunks of their cars. Yeah. Right?
And we saw that going back to the 1960s, the reports of people driving around with voting machines in the back of their car and that type of thing. You're always going to have that. I guess the thing for me personally, and I've talked about this, I said, because what scares me about the computerized voting is that if you're able to hack the actual voting system, you know, different from the ID stuff, but if you're able to hack the actual voting system, that gives you access from a remote area to be able to manipulate things across the country, or you can manipulate from the top of the ballot to the bottom of the ballot. I mean, if you get in there, the payoff is so incredibly large that it really is a big honeypot, you know, for people in terms of the allure, sure. I think.
No differently than casino systems, right? And in a lot of ways, rigging a casino machine to walk out the door with $1 million in cash, in a lot of ways, is probably a bigger prize than most other things. And the industry has dealt with that threat. We can deal with the threat of the hacking and the cyber attacks on election systems. We really can. It really comes down to a question of will and money. But I don't know how we don't insist that the same protections that go into slot machines aren't already in most of the machines that conduct our elections. I know some of the machines that conduct our elections do have this in there. They all should have it, and if we have that, I think we can all rest a bit easier about it.
Well, that is a good analogy. I guess we'll end on that. I think that there's many analogies that could be drawn between the electoral system and a casino. The house always wins, I think, in both cases. So, but that is very interesting. And I'm sure I haven't had a chance to read your book. I didn't get a copy of it yet because I wanted to get you on quickly. But I'm sure it is very interesting. I think people will be interested to see what you found in in 2020 that people are still talking about. And more importantly, what does that portend for the election that's coming up now? And I guess maybe about 90 days or something like that. And what can we do? Certainly, there's not going to be anything that we can do to fix it between now and then. But it gives us some idea of what we can still expect. But then we really do need to take, I think, one thing everybody agrees, that we need to do something to make the electoral system more trustworthy, that people have confidence that their vote is counted and counted accurately. I think that is of paramount importance. And so it's very, I'm glad to see that you wrote a book about your experience with that. And again, the book is Disproven: My Unbiased Search for Voter Fraud for the Trump Campaign, and the data that shows why he lost and how we can improve our elections. And by the way, you can find this at kenblock.com. There's a link there to buy the book, and you can get information about it there. Anything else you'd like to tell us about the book before we run out of time?
Yeah, I mean, look, the back of the book is the most important part of the book. Fixing our elections is patriotic. It's mission critical. It's the most important thing. Mike Lindell and I disagreed about the outcome of the elections, but we were in sync on the need to make changes to make things happen better. I've spoken to Republican secretaries of state. I've spoken to Democratic secretaries of state. There is a lot of overlap in agreement on some of the things that we should be doing to make our elections better. And we need to move beyond where we're at in terms of our discussions of elections and looking backwards and dealing with whatever happens here in November. To move forward, we need to have an adult conversation about making our elections better and getting to it and taking this moment in time to really improve things.
Yeah, I agree. And it's not just that we would like to get the right answers, but I mean, in this time of polarization, if we don't have trustworthy elections, I'm very concerned that be civil war over it or something like that. A lot of talk about that on both sides. And so it's having something that you trust, that you can audit, that is really key. So again, you've got the second half of your book is about your recommendations for how to do that from somebody who is an expert on auditing it. And you've seen the tricks that can be pulled. And so that is, no system is going to be perfect. Any system can be infiltrated and has its own flaws. And so the question is, what do we do to try to minimize that and mitigate those risks? So thank you so much for the work that you do. And again, you can find this at kenblock.com, and the book is Disproven. Thank you so much, sir. Appreciate it.
Thanks, David.
Of biased and
false news has become all too common on social media.
More alarming, some media outlets publish things simply aren't true without checking facts first.
Unfortunately, some members of the media use their platforms to push their own personal bias and agenda to control exactly what people think. And this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
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 Break free from the usual script with a David Knight Show, a fresh perspective bringing you genuine insights on current events. But if the show is going to stay on the air, we'll need your continued support. Sharing the show, subscribing, and even just hitting the like button all help. And if you found our show helpful, please consider donating and becoming a part of a community that values the truth. Because independent, listener-funded news, untouched by corporate globalist agendas, is extremely important.